So we'll now move on to the panel session to discuss in greater detail the role breeding can play in ensuring forgotten foods are able to meet their potential impact. This is our panel for today. I will introduce our panel chair, Professor Sayed Azam-Ali, CEO of Crops for the Future, UK. Sayed has a background in tropical agronomy and global food security research. He was the founding CEO of Crops for the Future Research Center in Malaysia, the world's first center for research solely on underutilized crops, and was past chair of the Association of International Research and Development Centers for Agriculture. Sayed recently launched a book, The Ninth Revolution, Transforming Food Systems for Good, which considers the role of diversity and crop diversification in international food systems. In 2021, Sayed was awarded an OBE for services to underutilized crops and increasing food security in the Queen's New Year's Honors List. He was also my supervisor on my PhD, so thank you very much, and over to you, Sayed.
Thank you, Pedro. If I may just, and I know time is very tight, I want to just make 2 points, and I just say hello to everybody wherever you are and welcome to this panel session. But in introduction, Pedro mentioned 4 crops that provide over 65% of the world's food: wheat, rice, maize, and soy. None of those are indigenous to Africa. So in the context of Africa, this meeting now couldn't be more timely, because of those 4 crops, wheat, 34% of global wheat supplies come from 2 countries, Ukraine and Russia. So again, for Africa, this has enormous significance. In Wole's comments, he mentioned the role of women, and again, it's particular to Africa, not just the role of women farmers, but women farmers involved and with the repository of knowledge on underutilized or forgotten foods. And indeed, in Presidor's presentation, he mentioned, and of course he described Bambara groundnut. One of the common names for Bambara groundnut is the groundnut of the women. So I think in all of this, the context couldn't be more important, and the timing of this panel session and discussion couldn't be more relevant. I want to introduce the 5 speakers very briefly, and then leave time, of course, for discussion and as possible question and answers from the audience. So let me introduce Ayoni Ogunbayo, who has over 20 years working experience in international agricultural research centers, IATA, Africa, Rice, ICRISAT, and CIAT. Currently, Ayoni is a plant breeder at CIAT and is working on the HarvestPlus program in the Democratic Republic of Congo. She focused on breeding, testing, and releasing varieties of biofortified cassava, maize, beans, and sweet potato. So that's our first panelist. Our second panelist, Dr. Dorcas Ibitoye, is a plant breeder at the National Institute of Horticulture in Nigeria, with particular interest in okra, plantain, banana, papaya, and tomato. Our third panelist is Dr. Ian Dawson, who's a reader at the Scotland's Rural College and an associate fellow at World Agroforestry, ICRAF, which supports the African Orphan Crops Consortium. His research focuses on the domestication of a broad range of crops, from major staples to new crops. With colleagues, he recently carried out a survey on breeders' approaches to forgotten crops in Africa. Dr. Matthew Milner works as part of the transformation team at NIAB in Cambridge, and is interested in all things related to plant nutrition. His recent work has included a focus on teff. Dr. Peter Emmrich is a John Innes Foundation Fellow at the Norwich Institute for Sustainable Development at the University of East Anglia. His work combines crop research, social science, and climate science approaches for sustainable agriculture, specifically improving the underutilized legume crop grass pea, Lathyrus sativus. So I've introduced the panel very briefly, and I welcome them all to this session. I want to be able to just focus on 3 questions. What are the priorities to be addressed? What is the need for better breeding? and what, of course, are the opportunities for collaboration. And just in passing, I know from just the number of people at this session, the enormous potential there is natural collaboration between African partners and UK expertise. So I think this is really very timely for us to have this discussion at this point. Let me ask the first question. How are we going to do this differently? Forgotten foods are not mainstream species. So can I ask any of the panelists, what should we do differently with forgotten foods compared to how we approach the business as usual breeding that we have currently had on the mainstream species? Please, can I ask any of you to address that, and we'll take the same question as we go through to all of the panelists. Who would like to take that on first?
Well, I can start, Sayed, if you like, with a few comments. So, I mean, I think the first thing is we're not aiming to do the same thing as we've done for major crops in the past. So we're not looking for a situation where, you know, forgotten foods replace those crops. And, you know, as a result of that, we will be focusing on different types of trade for importance and for action. And as you mentioned, Sayed, we did a survey a couple of years ago on the views of breeders on where to focus in terms of orphan crop improvement. The three things that we got from that was, one, how these crops integrate into production systems, two, focusing on processability issues, and third, focusing on farm labor costs. So those were the key areas that we identified through that survey, as well as the traits which are common for all crops, not just for forgotten foods, but would be things like pest and disease resistance and yield per se. So those were those three areas, integration, processability, and labor costs were where we think the emphasis should lie based on this survey.
Thanks, Ian. Same question for all of you, but can I turn to Dorcas just at this stage, because the leadership has to come from Africa, and it has to come from, in much of this, from African women who are the repository of knowledge on many of these crops. So how should we do this differently than we have classically done breeding on mainstream staple crops?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity given me. If we are going to do this differently for our forgotten crops, I hope I can be heard.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, if you want to go differently, I would like to go the way of iron. However, I would like to admit here that most of these are forgotten foods are being kept by the local farmers, and most of the stakeholders have to be brought in from the beginning, right from the inception of the design, the product design that we want to do, because the traditional knowledge lie and resides with this farmers over the years, even though they have not been so much improvement in the line of the genetic research, food and nutrition security. We have to first of all have something like we call like the innovation platform system, whereby all the stakeholders along the value chain are carried along from the start of the design of the product, so that the adoption of these improved materials will be readily, because they will own the technology, they will own the product, and then the breeding, they will be able to be involved in the breeding cycle. Thank you.
Thank you. Ayoni, can you add to that from an African perspective?
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much, Dom, and thank everyone. Good afternoon. There are many points that we need to discuss, but I will just briefly a few points that are really affecting the forgotten food, especially in Africa. One of the things that we need to do is to try as much as possible to raise awareness, especially on the nutritional value of forgotten food. When I was in Mali, when I was working with HarvestPlus, we try to develop what we call smart food. And we try to create awareness and which people accepted, and some farmers, they are really working on it. And the other thing that we also need to take into consideration is to also look at how to characterize all these materials, because by the time we have information about them, we'll be able to identify the good genes that can be used, especially some of the forgotten food that we are not working on. And I also like to raise is that we must to also promote sustainable seed system, because when we don't have seed, it will be very difficult for breeders or researchers to work on forgotten food. And the another thing that's very important is what we call policies. Policy is very important because we need to carry the policymakers along to let them know the importance of forgotten food, and to also let them know the nutritional value that we can get from the forgotten food. And the last point that I would also like to raise here, to mention here, is that only a few people are working on this forgotten food. So we also need to train breeders, especially young scientists, to work on this forgotten food. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ayoni. I think Wally in his introduction mentioned something like 47% of what we now call forgotten foods, underutilized crops, are indigenous to the continent of Africa. And with this introduction, Dorcas and Ayoni have illustrated the role, if you like, of business, not doing this as business as usual. How can I ask Matthew and then Peter to reflect on this in terms of how UK can support non-business as usual improvement in non-mainstream crops? Matthew.
So I would say just using our expertise. So for instance, the work we've done on teff recently, we've helped develop a lot of sequence for teff varieties that are being grown currently in Ethiopia. And we've just made those publicly available, right? And so all we've done is really sequence and then give it back to the Ethiopian government. And that way, the entrepreneurial spirit in Ethiopia can just take it however they want. The big problem that I keep encountering is the technology in many parts of Africa just isn't there. So breeding the way we would do it here in Europe can't happen in Africa. They don't have marker-assisted breeding. They don't have, GBS type of computer systems, and the cost of getting those reagents to African scientists is just too high, and that's my big problem. I know Gates has tried to address this, but it just needs a lot of infrastructure to do the breeding that we do for rice, wheat, maize, on all these other small crops.
Just to illustrate, you've mentioned the technology is not there in Africa. What is the role, say, of NIAB in supporting the technological backup, if you like, for the genetic resources that are actually indigenous to Africa?
So I will plug our quantitative plant breeding course. As some of the other panelists have said, coming just to Cambridge and learning how to do quantitative genetics. We've now made that an online course, so because all things COVID, we couldn't get together anymore. Those resources are being developed so that, people all over the world can use them. And understanding, the genetics and the decisions made and how you breed for multiple traits at the same time is not simple. And so I think sharing that knowledge with the rest of the world is going to be vital.
Thank you. Peter, do you want to come back on this question of support for non-businesses?
Yes, my experience, which mostly relates to East Africa, is that there's a huge variety of levels of capacity in different institutions, and many of the NARs have made really great advances in the last decade or so in terms of their capacity, both in the training of their staff and in the materials that they have access to. So I know that from EIAR in Ethiopia, from Kemri and Calro in Kenya, Naro in Uganda, there are really big advances in what they are able to do, and also what collaborations they are able to contribute to because of that. However, it so often comes down to individuals. You will occasionally find individual people who will do incredible things with very limited capabilities, and they will make things happen that you wouldn't have thought possible just because of their ability and conviction. And conversely, you will sometimes find institutions or research centers that have really great equipment, and it's just sitting there gathering dust because you don't have those really transformative people. So I think a really key challenge is to find those people and put them into the positions where they have access to the tools and the staff that they need to really make transformations happen. But in terms of the brilliance of African scientists that I've encountered, and in terms of the progress that's already been made over the last decade, I think there's a very good path to a lot of this breeding work happening in Africa, done by Africans.
Thank you, Peter. I think that's the question of individuals and leadership, I think, is really interesting point. And I think, I think this is really a key area that we have to develop. But let me take it a little bit further, and it's an issue that we've already touched on. There is no magic bullet. We're not going to find one trait that's going to transform any of these crops, let alone all of them. But breeding is part of a value chain. So how do we build breeding in, and seed systems to that extent, into the work that we're going to need across the whole value chain? And again, let me, because I know a number of people have mentioned this in terms of traits that are desirable. Let me just ask Dorcas to start with a conceptualization really of the whole value chain and where breeding sits in that in terms of the priorities and how it links up with the value chain through to products and consumers.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sayed. What we did in our breeding program is, first of all, to do a kind of a participatory appraisal with our stakeholders. For the crop that I'm working with, we decided to go to the farmers, to the consumers, the marketers, and then work with them to identify their traits of preference. So they decided that you find out that the marketers or the consumers have their own lines of preferences for the traits they're expecting in any improved varieties. Many of them have the local varieties that they have been growing over the years, and they actually, from the participatory work that has been carried on, especially on okra, we find out that they are expectant of improved varieties. However, they have their listed number of preferred traits. And so we were able together to work with them, and then we're like, okay, in order of preference, can we prioritize these traits? Because there cannot be a single variety that will solve all the problems that you have listed here. And from that understanding down from the stakeholders, we were able to come home and look at the genetic base of our crop and see if, and then evaluate those crops for the particular traits. Like we do a kind of pre-breeding morphological information, because we do not have that support for the genotyping efforts. And even some of the crops in the markers are not even there. So what we did with the come back home is to evaluate those germplasm for the morphological and agronomic traits that the farmers, with the team of experts in other fields with us, and then we are able to document that information and make selection based on the evaluation that we have done for those particular traits. And in the case whereby we do not have some parents that combine all the traits together, then we go into our hybridization block and they start the hybridization and then do the population enhancement and advancement. But we have not yet reached the final goal. When we reach the final goal, we go back to the farmers, the growers, and then we test these materials with them. We do the selection with them. So at the end of the day, the farmers are able to have a part in the materials that have been developed. So this is the channel that we are trying to follow in order to improve the varieties of the forgotten crops that we are working on. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to take Ian and then Matthew and Peter to reflect on this, but as technical specialists, how do you feel you can fit into this issue that Dorcas has really illustrated, that we have to look at the whole value chain and in fact turn it around the other way and say, what is the demand rather than what is the supply of genetic resources, and what are the demands that consumers will want that these crops are actually going to have to fulfill. Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Sayed. Yeah, it's, as you say, you know, demand is a key issue, and understanding for us, I think the key thing that we've tried to look at a bit is success factors in intervention for previous crops that have been mainstreamed in Africa. And so, you know, what has caused success to be reached? Is it production side interventions, or is it consumption side interventions, market interventions, and what's the balance between the two? And, you know, that success has been achieved by both type of intervention, but there's very little systematic research on how production and consumption side interventions interact to promote success. So for us, we see that as a key area for research, you know, what's the optimal way to intervene to promote mainstreaming? Is it production? Is it consumption? It's probably both, but what combination of both? And of course, it will be crop specific as well, but we see that as a key area for research, how those things interact.
Peter, do you want to add to that in this context?
Yes, I think Dorcas is making a really crucial point here. We're dealing with a really broad range of different plants that are so many different species, different genera, different families. And as plant scientists, if we move from one to the other, we're almost starting back from scratch with an entirely new genome, entirely different sets of markers. Sometimes we can transfer from one species to another, but that's always saddled with difficulties. So it's a really, really big challenge to get many of the breeding tools that we've developed for our major crops into use for this huge number of different species. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that there are reasons for why these foods are forgotten. These reasons come from history, they come from often history of colonization, they come from the economics of international trade of different foods. And without being clear of why we're seeing some of these crops being overused and some of these crops being forgotten, it's going to be difficult to shift that, and it won't be successful to do that just from the supply side. So what we need, and I think this is echoing a point that Ibrahim was making in the chat, is a valuation of those foods within their cultural contexts. I'm sure we can all think of the forgotten foods of our own communities, wherever we are in the world, things that we value really highly because they are associated with our own culture, our upbringing, they are associated with thoughts of home. And that is what we need to tap into. We need to understand why different communities value individual foods and bring that thinking back and have those foods thought of something that is worth cherishing, worth incorporating into your diets, rather than as something we should get rid of because they're old foods and we all should shift to more westernized diets.
Thank you. Matthew?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is as we start to breed for these, a lot of the points that the speakers made, like increased nutritional value, are going to change. And that's kind of a drawback of kind of modern breeding. Because the farmer typically gets paid on yield. They don't get paid on these nutritional traits. They don't get paid for, you know, it's hard to follow nutrition for 30 years to show that this variety is truly better than that. And that's the time span where nutrition really matters. And so that's my big concern. We've shown that in wheat, that just simply fortifying the grain itself doesn't actually improve absorption. So sometimes we're breeding for the wrong trait because it's easier and it's cheaper, and it's not because that's truly what we need to be breeding for. And so I think there's a lot, and every speaker has said it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be quick. So
young member of the audience not declared himself, but Ayoni, I want you to just pick up on those points that have been made in terms of how we bring breeding into the whole value chain, but also the point that's been made earlier about, you know, the stigma attached to some of these crops. These are, you know, seen as poor people's crops, you know, aging farmers, and the status of these crops. So how do we build a breeding system in that actually sees a different perception of these crops?
Okay, thank you very much. Right. The system that we are using here, DRC, is one of we have built a very strong synergy among the major actors, like that is breeders, farmer, processor, and distributor, because we are working on the biofortified crops. Some of the forgotten food that many farmers are not working on, we have improved them by trying as much as possible to improve them to have a biofortified crops, like sweet potatoes and cassava and beans and some other crops like that. So now what we are doing presently is to carry along farmers along so that we select the best variety together. And at the same time, we also carry out the test, that is, we allow the processors and distributors to also involve in the processing so that at the end, the farmers and the consumers, they accept the product that we have on ground. And as I said earlier, we are using demand-driven applied research, which are acceptable by the farmers, because when we talk about biofortification, it's just to increase the density of vitamins or minerals in a crop using conventional method. So because many people sometimes they are afraid of transgenic or some other things like that, but this one, we develop them through conventional, and farmers, they really appreciate it. In some other places where they are not planting, where farmers and consumers and processors, they have accepted it, especially some of the parts called Kwilu and Kasai and in DRC. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. We will try and squeeze in questions from participants who aren't on the panel, but I want each of the panelists now to reflect on one question that really it's been touched on. Peter mentioned the why as opposed to the how, and this is the same issue, the barriers. Why are there barriers? So this will be the Zoom poll that we're going to have at the end of the session as well. But let me ask each of you in turn, what barriers need to be broken to get forgotten foods to be mainstream crops? And I'm just going to take us around the table. So essentially, I'll take you in order to answer that question. What are the barriers that you see that are actually going to have to be broken if we're going to get what we have discussed for many years as forgotten foods, forgotten crops, into becoming part of mainstream global food production? Matthew?
So I would say demand from the end consumer, because that will drive all research into improving yield, improving nutrition, that will drive economic gains, that will drive everything. And so if people want to eat it, just like wheat, rice, and soy, then the money will flow to it and improve those things.
Okay. Ian, demand. We've done that one.
Yeah, so a bit of a variation on Matthew, but really the same thing. But I would say demand determined by affordable price. So slight variation.
The demand and affordability. I'm sure we're going to get accessibility as well, but demand and affordability. Peter?
Because I can't say the same again. We do need to look across the entire value chain and figure out where the barriers are, because demand and supply don't operate in entirely separate from each other, and they influence each other. And it could be that the barrier for a particular leafy crop is that it's difficult to transport it from the areas where it is grown to the towns in the same country. So if that is the place, then there might need to be an intervention to make it easier to transfer that one food, or it might need an intervention to make that food being used in the schools in the rural area. So it could be something quite specific in the middle of a value chain that then links up the existing demand or the existing supply to increase production overall.
Okay, so we've got demand, we've got affordability, accessibility, and we've got to break these silos that we have as scientists and researchers across the whole value chain in terms of a research value chain that breaks these disciplinary barriers that we're familiar with. Ayoni, so we've got that context. What are the barriers you see where you're sitting?
Okay. Yeah, I think one of the barriers that we have to look at is to try as much as possible to make adequate awareness of the nutritional value of forgotten food, that is advocacy. In DRC here, that's one of the things that we are doing for biofortified crops, because we have to let the consumers and farmers aware the nutritional quality of forgotten food. And at the same time, we must also make sure that we have data, especially on the nutritional quality, so that people, researchers can use it, and at the same time, consumers and producers and farmers, they can also accept the crops that you are promoting. So these 2 points, they are very, very important: advocacy, and we must also have data, information on the forgotten food, especially nutritional quality. Thank you.
Thank you. So
yeah,
certainly advocacy, but advocacy based on evidence, and therefore we have to get evidence into a form that is accessible for people, communities, institutions to use. Dorcas, I want to leave the last word with you, because these barriers are ones that you will face and Africa faces every day in terms of how your crops, our crops, become crops that are actually seen outside Africa. Just in context, I am pretty old, I know, but when I was a student, Africa produced 10% of the world's food. It now produces 4% of global export. So you can see the challenges that Africa faces in terms of mainstreaming mainstream crops, let alone forgotten food. So what do you see are the critical barriers that have to be overcome?
A perception of our indigenous people to these improved varieties, I see it as a barrier, because many times you introduce a new crop to them and they are just used to their own, the ones that they have been used to. So it's a major barrier, and that is where we have to talk about the social inclusion and taking into consideration why we are going on developing this model for improving our forgotten foods. We have to take the adequate care of their cultural beliefs and background as associated with these crops. And that will be, once we are able to break that barrier, then it will be very easy for the breeders or scientists to work and change and improve on these particular varieties and take it back to them for easy adoption, and then consumer acceptability, every other thing inside the products profile that we have developed will be easy to promote. And then the demand and supply comes in. So I believe the cultural background and the perception of the indigenous people to these crops that we are talking about is very key barrier that we have to look into. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to come to collaboration, because really this is the purpose of this session, is to try and bring players and partners together in the UK and especially across Africa. But I'm just trying to pick up a question that is coming from the Q&A, and I'll try and broaden it, but it talks about quinoa, and of course we all know the case study of quinoa, but let me broaden that. Rather than we've all got a favorite crop which we think should be a mainstream crop, how do you see this to be done as individual species improvement or platform technologies that we can apply across numerous species, because we simply don't have the time and the energy and the money to do crop by crop? Let's go in the other order. Ayoni, do you see this as something where we have to pick a candidate species or a list of candidate species that are the crops that we really should be focusing on, or we've really got to generate capacity and platforms that we can apply to different crops?
Okay. Sayed, can you come in? Hello, Sayed.
Sorry, did you pick up the question?
I can't hear you well. Okay.
Let me just, while we're getting your line back, let me ask the same question of Peter. So we're really dealing with platforms or candidate species, exemplar crops?
I think the key is to embrace the diversity. There will be a few candidate species that can make a really big difference and should probably just transition to being major crops. But there will be many, many more that have really important roles in either cultural systems or have climate resilience characteristics that make them very valuable in some contexts. And it's also important to understand those crops and promote them in those right contexts. And that is probably best done at a national level by researchers who are really familiar with those particular crops and can do that work on the ground. So at that level, I think the platform building is going to be essential.
Ian?
Yeah, I mean, I think a focus on a number of case study crops is useful, you know, to demonstrate the ability to make progress. And so I would see that as an important approach.
Okay. And again, saying Matthew, how do you see NIAB and you working in this in terms of specific crops or platform technologies that we can bridge?
So I would say probably platform technologies. I think, again, cost of sequencing, cost of marker development is coming way, way down very quickly. One of the questions was bringing down NGS costs. And so literally just giving access to kind of our computing systems, you know, so that research can happen. And then at the same time, as a person that works at the gene level, a gene that works in rice does the same thing in wheat 9 times out of 10. And so you don't have to do everything for each crop. So biofortification, an example, you can increase zinc or iron content because the underlying genes are almost always the same. And so those, you can, if you understand the system, you can then drive gains in a broad range of crops.
That's very helpful, thank you. Dorcas, just from your perspective, is it a crop that you want investment in, or do you want technologies or platforms that can apply across a number of species that you're interested in?
Can you come again, please, Sayed? Hello?
Hello, can you hear us?
Yes, can you come again with a question?
Yeah, is it a list of crops that you have in mind that you need support and backup, or is it technologies and platforms that can be applied across species?
The technology platform would be a way to go by. Maybe so since we don't have the infrastructure to use the genomic sequencing and the genomic analysis, I believe that if the platform is available, maybe in the UK, we have the materials here. We can do the phenotyping, the genotyping can be done for us. That information we can use to advance our breeding activities down here.
Thanks. Great. Ayoni, we got cut off, so let me just come back to you last.
Okay, thank you, Sayed. I think I will join other colleagues, especially Dorcas, because in Africa here, what we need to do is just to set up a technology platform where we can work on different crops that we have, because the challenges that most of our NAS, that is National Agricultural Research System, they are facing is that they have good forgotten food, they have materials, but they don't have access to technology, especially how to strain them or maybe how to genotype them. So these are the things that are really affecting them. So if we can have a technology platform, it will really help Africans, especially African scientists, to carry out deforestation so that we'll be able to identify the genes that are really good, especially those varieties that have good quality traits. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I may, because we've run out of time, but it's been very, very helpful and stimulating. But I wanted to leave us with a thought, and this is really just by looking at the number of participants, 185 participants, and that's unusual anyway, but let alone for a meeting of this type on non-mainstream staple, top-end crops. So that itself is incredibly encouraging. But if I may, out of those 185, essentially we've got two communities. We've got the African community of researchers and scientists, breeders and advocates, and we've got a UK capacity to actually support that. And that's very striking that this is such a large capacity that the UK actually has. In terms of collaboration, if I may, it seems to me we have to get those two communities to talk to each other first so that we can actually provide as much of the critical mass of support for an African-wide initiative that's actually supported by UK expertise. And if that's the case, maybe these barriers we have to look at in terms of what are the platforms, what are the technologies that the UK actually has that is ready and good to go, rather than, you know, must wait 5 years before we can do anything. And perhaps that could be some of the discussion that you have in the follow-up sessions when there's networking between you, is to see what your continental and in the UK national capacity is to support this global effort. And forgotten foods really have to become part of mainstream in the next 10 years, because we've got the Sustainable Development Goals, if nothing else, but from all the other challenges we face. I'm going to hand back to Pedro at that point, but thank all of the panelists, and particularly all of those who've stayed on and been listening and participating in this important discussion. Pedro.
Thank you very much, Sayed, and thank you all the panelists for the engaging discussion and very informative. I will, yes, sorry, I'll start sharing my screen again. And so, thank you. On behalf of our Kirkhouse Trust, and while we are all here today, I just wanted to take the chance to share with you a funding opportunity. Kirkhouse Trust is looking for proposals from African researchers on projects looking to complete research into tropical legumes. Successful proposals will receive funding for their pilot project, and the deadline is the 21st of March. If you want to know more about this call, please get in contact with Fleur Gigan to learn more, and hopefully one of my colleagues will drop Fleur's contact in the chat box.